Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. I would like to welcome you to Courtney Scott's OFCCP Retooled Contractor Compliance webinar series. I would like to address some preliminary items before we start today's briefing. Currently, all listeners' phones are muted. At any time during the presentation, please feel free to submit a question in the GoToWebinar question box. We will try to answer all questions. Today's topic is OFCCP Federal Contractor Portal Legal Compliance Issues. Our presenters are Courtney Scott attorneys Bert Fishman and Nita Beecher. And I will now turn the program over to today's moderator, Nita Beecher.
Hi, welcome to our first of a series of three webinars that we're going to do on OFCCP. Bert, it's very nice to have you with me today.
It's a pleasure to be here, and we're actually getting to talk about an emerging topic of significant importance, and I'm glad everybody has joined us, and I hope we can be of service.
So today's topic is going to be talking about the Contractor Portal, before we get started with that, first I want to, as hopefully all of you know, we are part of Courtney Scott. We're a woman-owned Washington, D.C. law firm representing clients on workplace matters. In particular, we represent employees in front of agencies, and that includes our friends at OFCCP. Today's webinar is one of a series, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, of three. Next Tuesday, we're going to talk about Directive 2022-1 on compensation, and the following Tuesday, on April the 26th, we're going to talk about the new directive on audits, which is 2022-02, and we have been discussing these matters as well on our podcast, so please listen in and subscribe to our podcast. Next slide. Bert?
Well, let me just give you a brief overview of what we'll be talking about this afternoon or morning, depending on where you are. The first is an update on the Contractor Portal, and we'd like to give you a little background to how we got there. So we're going to start with the GAO Report to kind of give you the grounding for why all of these changes are happening and how they came into being. We'll follow that with issues to consider in registering for certification. This includes some of the technical problems that people have already discovered and how you can work around them. And then we'll focus briefly on the budget, the OFCC budget and next steps. It's a topic that is too little considered because we think that the nature of the budget, which was very, 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 very scant, will have a practical impact on the ambitions of the agency. So let's move on. And you can see that the rollout of the Contractor Portal is already in full swing. As many of you know, the registration portal opened. Most of us didn't do anything until there was a webinar by the OFCCP on March 31st, which was still available on their website, and if you haven't seen it, you ought to. They did their very best to try to explain the contractor certification process, and the process opened at the end of March. It closes on June 30th, 2022. That is 75 days, folks, and as you'll see as we go through what is included in the certification and the steps you'll have to take to certify, urge you to get your act together. This is going to be a significant effort. We'll tell you how in the future, at least, the verification and certification process will have a significant impact on your likelihood of being on a CSAL and being audited. So try as best we can, and we'll help you as much as we can to get your ducks in a row as quickly as possible. Next slide, please.
So as you mentioned, Bert, we're going to kick it off by talking a little bit about the GAO report from 2016. It was, I think, devastating might be the proper word for this report and what it said about what OFCCP was up to. Basically, as this slide points out, it says that OFCCP had no reasonable assurance that federal contractors were complying with its regulations and that its scheduling process focused on contractors least at risk of compliance. And they pointed out in this, this is 2016, so they're looking at data beginning in 2010, that 78% of the evaluations, that the audits, as we call them, that OFCCP was doing, they found no violations at all, not even technical ones. And only 2% of those total violations were actually found any discrimination findings. And yet, OFCCP, you know, it's that famous saying, Bert, that when you continue to do things over and over again, you get the same and expect a different results. It's a big mistake. Go ahead.
You know, one of the things that has always perplexed me is why the agency didn't declare success. When you're doing this for 40 years and your most recent data shows that only 2% of the audits that you're doing find anything that resembles discrimination, why don't you recognize that this may be the most successful government program in history, that there is voluntary compliance across the board, but instead, the agency appears to have taken the tack that you guys are all violating, we just haven't found it yet, and thus a series of recommendations were made. Nita?
Well, and I think that's part of the problem, and we're going to talk a little bit about the shift in the agency. The Obama approach with Director Hsu was very similar to, we know there are violations, we just haven't found them yet, to the Director Lean's approach that, you know, we're here to help. And we believe we're back to the Director Hsu, we just haven't found it yet approach. And we'll talk a little bit. David Fortney was actually was actually at an ABA conference a week or so ago, where a lot of conversations were held with DOL, and this is pretty much their belief. But coming back to the agency report, they basically said that the GAO said you need to change your selection process to focus on people who are actually violating and not on people who are not. And just to follow up to that, the current process that we have, the Institute for Workplace Equality found that the most recent CSAL list focused on 56 companies out of thousands of federal contractors, all of whose establishments have been audited multiple times and found no violations. So clearly, the selection process, at least up to the most recent CSAL, is broken. Second, you need to create a mechanism for verifying compliance, and that's what we're going to talk about today, the verification process that Director Lean put into place. And finally, and this is something I think we're going to talk about, let's go back just one more on that slide. Finally, and I think this, Bert, is something we need to talk about a little bit more, that they needed to improve and clarify guidance for contractors. I think that was done, and we'll talk about that under Director Lean, but I think we're about to go back into the wilderness as far as contractor guidance moving forward.
Well, let's go to the next slide and we'll see, as I say, the gradual progress to how we got here. The GAO recommendations had a kind of clarion call impact on the agency, and they actually responded. Former Director Lean issued a directive to develop the verification program, culminating in what we have now. And they even published a notice for comments for an affirmative action verification program, doing it exactly according to Hoyle, trying to get it right. Lean made a genuine effort to respond to really very strong criticism. And as Nita pointed out, the agency knew that its audit process was kind of broken. And then they focused on verification as being the linchpin of the agency's enforcement system. And we'll talk about why that is, because in order to verify, you must do a rather thorough examination of your entire AAP process, not just the affirmative action plan. Part of this was developing a new way of creating CSALs, and they're in the process now of developing algorithms to try to break this history of going back to the same 4 dozen contractors. In the future, once the verification process is rolling, and once they have data from the certification and verification process, those contractors who are not able to certify that they are compliant with the entire AAP, the Affirmative Action Program, are more likely than not to be the ones that are audited. So think of the verification process really as the triggering mechanism for all that's going to follow. And it is also the funneling device to get you to look at your programs and be able to certify. Anita?
Well, the other thing that David learned from DOL in some of the sessions the ABA had is for those establishments, those contractors and those establishments that are not certified, they're going to be number 1 on the list. They made it absolutely clear that that's going to be their number 1 criterion for selection moving forward once they get this data, which they don't have. I did want to mention, they also mentioned at the ABA meeting that they have developed a new algorithm. Now, this is even before they get the information from the verification, but at this point we're expecting a new CSAL list out of this new algorithm to come out probably in May or June. So it'll be interesting to see if they actually have contractors who have not been audited on the list as opposed to those who were audited, multiple times.
Yes, this is a vision of the usual suspects. If we could go to the next slide, we'll see where we go from here. Things started changing with the new administration, and building on, or at least assertedly building on the recommendations of the GAO. Under Director Lean, the agency decided finally to clearly articulate the standards, the published standards, for its assessments of contractor efforts to comply with all of the efforts of the Affirmative Action Program. They created standards, they increased transparency. Recently, Director Yang frankly rescinded almost all of Director Lean's efforts, rescinded transparency, rescinded the directive on compensation, on efficiency, and we are back to a different system. But just look at what's happened. We don't, as Nita pointed out, we have a series of webinars on these new directives, but there were 2 new directives changing the compensation, the way that compensation will be assessed. It imposes new disclosure requirements, including something to do with pay equity. We're not exactly sure what that constitutes. They have a new audit directive, which rescinds a number of existing directives and vastly expands the agency's discretion on how they assess whatever it is you're doing. But the last is a new regulation, of proposed regulations regarding predetermination notices and notice of violations, which sounds like it's inside baseball. But the real impact of the proposal is to eliminate those published evidentiary standards that Director Lean made as the core of his compliance efforts, basing on the notion that unless you know the standards by which you will be judged, there's no way that a contractor can assess its own compliance. And it's no way that a contractor can challenge a determination by the agency. So it's important. We're not going to talk about the substance of it. I say we have hours devoted to them. The thing that I want you all to understand, and I apologize, we'll probably repeat this 3 or 4 times. These directives are effective immediately. So you must come to terms with what they require, because compliance with these directives is part of what compliance means when you go to certify in the verification portal. So it's all linked together. It's an enormous burden. I don't know how everybody's going to get it all done in the short time, the 75 days that they have. But think about the way in which these are all linked, and how verification is the methodology, is that funnel that causes you to comply with the directives and perhaps even the new PDN. Nita?
I do think it's ironic that the directive, which we'll be talking about on April the 26th, is rescinding the directives that Director Lean issued on transparency, efficiency, and most interestingly, contractor recognition. And so, nevertheless, but moving forward, on to the contractor portal.
Yeah, the one thing that everybody should understand when they confront the new OFCCP is that the combined impact of the new directives, the verification portal, the proposed NPRM, it all increases agency discretion, and it returns us to that kind of black box of not knowing what the standards are that you'll be judged with the kind of particularity that was true under the directives that were published by Director Lean. But let's move on to the OFCCP Contractor Portal. Nita has been involved in this from day one, so I'll be happy to turn the microphone back to her.
And I apologize. I sit on a main street in St. Louis, and the fire trucks and the just go up and down the street periodically, and so you will be hearing them live. So I know that many of you have already had an opportunity to attend OFCCP's webinar, the one that Bert mentioned when they opened the registration on February 1, and in addition, the one that they did on March 31. They were actually pretty good. They provided a lot of information, a lot of they have a very good user guide and so forth on the landing page. But I think what we wanted to do was dig a little deeper for the things that we are seeing and people are talking about, and also looking at what the legal issues that are being raised by both the registration and then separately by your certification. So we know for the fact of the pandemic, the most recent EEO1 reports available to OFCCP are from 2018. We recognize that that's a long time ago in the world of pandemic. However, they did not get the 2019 data and the 2020 data until fall of this past year of 2021. So they're stuck and we are stuck with the 2018 EEO1 reports. What's important about those, as we know, is they are the basis, one, for who's your parent, who is the parent of this federal contractor. And they are pulling these EEO1 reports based on those parents who checked the box saying they were a federal contractor. So that's how you got on the list to begin with. They will then, you can, if you wish, pre-populate your establishments in the portal using your 2018 EEO1 reports. You all know that. But you really need to look at those reports before you do that for your registration. Because if you've had mergers, acquisitions, you've closed sites because of the pandemic and so forth, you really need to make sure those are the right establishments to use today. And OFCCP allows you to do that. In order to do that, once you review them up against your current establishments, you can go in and use what's known as the identifier not known, and you can upload those manually. We strongly recommend that you really look at this, because what you need to understand, and this was made pretty clear in the webinar that OFCCP held on March 31, and then re-held again, they played it again on April 7th, is that once you populate all of those establishments, you're going to have to decide whether you are certifying for each one of those that they are you are in fact in compliance. So it's a two-step process. You register, and then those are your establishments, and then you're going to have to decide if you're going to certify for those. Now they have a process by which you can deselect them But I suspect that deselected establishments are going to end up on the CSAL list unless you have a pretty good reason for not doing it. So it's very important to figure that out, I think, before you ever load your establishments. And I think that it was a little bit disingenuous in a way. OFCCP hasn't really told us when you load all your establishments, some of them are federal contractors and some of them are not. And if they're not federal contractors, obviously you deselect them. How does that impact those particular sites? And it's, not every parent believes that all of its sites are federal contractors. I'm not sure OFCCP agrees. Now, the other thing I think it's important for us to talk about is, as of today, OFCC or EEOC is supposed to open the portal for your 2021 EEO1s. This is a great time to look very carefully at how you are doing your EEO1s, because remember, what you do with your EEO1s and what boxes you check determine what's going to end up on this list down the road, because obviously they're going to keep loading the data as you go along. Bert, before we go to the next one, anything else that you can think of we ought to cover on this slide?
Not at this stage. I think there's some issues we'll be talking about in the next slide that go to the actual process of registration, and I think that's where we have more to contribute.
Okay. Yes. So we have heard there have been a number. It's new. For those of you who had to submit your EEO1s last year, you remember what a nightmare it was because they had a new system. This is the same thing. I think it's a little less wonky, but there are a number of issues. Apparently, for where there have been mergers or acquisitions which have occurred between 2018 and now, there are people who cannot register. They're getting in a cycle where they can't register. They try to get to the help desk, and they can't get to the help desk, and they can't register. And so if you have that problem, I would both email and call and leave voicemails with the help desk. I'm sure they're just overrun. I think that's pretty obvious. And so that's something I think is really important, is to, if you're having issues, stay on top of it, document it, and make sure, eventually I think they're going to catch up. We'll talk about the budget later, but that could be part of the problem. Bert?
One of my concerns is that although we are urging you to start early and try to get into the process early, everybody knows there's going to be a flood of registrations in the last half of June. Will the site survive? We have heard of all kinds of websites crashing with when they open, when there are big events coming. We have already seen that the help desk is overwhelmed. Do they have the technology? Do they have the technicians? Do they have the staffing they needed? It's a new program, so will they be prepared to handle the flow of data that's going to come during the last 2 weeks of June? And it remains to be seen. I have a feeling, I never bet on judges and agencies, but that the due date is flexible, and that we may have an extended due date when they see the flow of registrations in the last half of June. But my advice is start early. Start early.
Yeah. And they're going to say, honestly, Bert, they're going to say you've had since February 1 to register. So, where there are issues, it's important to go ahead. And at least at this point, once you've done your due diligence and figured out, are your 2018 EEO1 still the right establishments, then you can go in and automatically upload them. If they're not, you're going to have to go in and manually load them. Yes, Bert.
Well, the only other thing that every government agency believes that they are the most important thing in your life. And, all of this baloney about you've had since February 1st, as if you had nothing else to do, as if you're not also the HR staff, particularly preparing for a return to the office after COVID and all the problems that entails. of readjusting your
Right.
benefit schedules to adjust to the post-COVID world. You know, the OFCCP thinks this is all you're doing. So when they say, well, you've had since February, that's as if you didn't have a job that had other responsibilities. So please start early, ask
Yes.
as many questions as you can, do trial runs, and we'll talk more about the nuts and
Yeah.
bolts of registration. Please.
Anyway, so once you're able to do that, go ahead. Let's go back one just for a second. I just want to finish up a couple of thoughts here. Okay. Nope. Back 2 more. 1 more. Thank you. Just a couple of other things. Just they're not uploading. And one thing I really want to make a point about, we've discovered, and they warned us, that the primary administrator cannot easily be changed. So you have a primary administrator, preferably somebody in corporate office. That person can assign other people to fill in the data for other sites. But that primary is very difficult to change. And of course, with the help desk issues, it makes it very hard. So make sure you pick the right person to be your primary administrator, who will have the power to allow people to come in and out. All right, I think that's probably all we need to cover on that. But I did want to now, so early and often registration, I think that's really important. So going to the next slide, Bert, one of the other issues that's come up, and we've asked, and we finally have an answer. When we're doing these webinars, we hear OFCCP talking about AAPs, AAPs, AAPs. What does that mean? What are we certifying? We are certifying according to, and I know this is very small, but let me just read you what you're certifying. You are certifying that you have developed and maintained affirmative action programs at each establishment as applicable, and for each functional or business entity. See 41 CFR Chapter 60. 41 CFR at Chapter 60 is everything. It's 11246, 503, it's FEVRA, it's posting, it's applicants, it's plans, it's making sure that your FEVRA and 503 plans are available. It's all the nitty-gritty issues that you have to deal with to have an affirmative action program. So you are certifying under penalty of perjury. You and anyone else who signs this is under penalty of perjury, criminal perjury, that this is correct to the best of your knowledge. And you'll see at the bottom, the contractor attests. I attest that this affirmative action program certification is true and correct to the best of my knowledge, and I understand the penalty for making false statements with respect to this certification is prescribed in 18 USC 1001, which, Bert, is?
Well, it's a criminal statute. But what we have pressed this with the solicitor's office and with the agency, and they acknowledge the fact that the language is pretty terrible, pretty scary, but they also recognize that they will recognize good faith efforts. So
Correct.
They're not going to hold
That's
you
right.
like a judge in a court when you say
No.
virtually anything that's wrong could be a perjured statement. They are going to recognize your good faith efforts, which is another reason we urge you to start early and to go through this step by step.
So with that in mind, Bert, why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the legal concerns we have around certification over and above the perjury issue?
Okay, as we say, this is one of the things we're going to repeat a lot. Certification is everything. It's the entire affirmative action program. So it's for each establishment. It's not just AAPs. Remember the new compensation directive, that's part of it. Outreach, recruiting, steering, promotion, training, flow down, purchase orders to your flow down subcontractors, identifying, that in your utilization analysis, you always have problems, although they'll be seriously asking whether and in what way you'll be assessing those problems. Then what I would urge you to do is get the whole team together. Get HR, get recruiting, get the comp people, get your general counsel or your outside counsel. Remember, there's some controversy in the regulation about what's privileged. Seeking legal advice is always privileged, and it's absolutely privileged. It includes a carefully done Title VII pay equity analysis under the privilege. You'll be asked for more information than you've ever been asked for in the past. You'll be asked to deliver it sooner because they'll say you've had since February, you knew the certification was coming. And once an audit begins and after you certified, the agency's response is, well, you obviously have this at hand. You said you did when you certified. So
that's right.
Over and over, get the whole team together, have a common plan. This will be an enormously significant burden for all contractors. For contractors, some of whom are our clients with dozens, even hundreds of AAPs, this will be a challenge, both to the contractor and to the agency. So all I can do is urge you to start early. A significant challenge to all of you is what this constitutes. But part of what we're trying to help you with is to understand what you have to do. And knowing that is at least step one in the process. And now you've got to get your team together to be compliant so that you can certify and be prepared. You know, not everybody on the C-cell is going to be a so-called bad boy. You know, the algorithm is going to include random contractors as well. So be prepared, start early, get all of the tentacles in the shop working on this same problem.
Moving to the next slide, and I think just to close that out, Bert, you know, we have over the years worked with clients on their AAPs. And sometimes the AAP process for the year drags on because, honestly, a lot of companies don't really see AAPs as very important. And plus HR, at least in my experience, they just have so much on their plate right now. It's just hard to get it done, get the data, and so forth. This is going to make your life much more difficult. You are going to have to pull all this stuff together and have it ready each year to certify. And then when the OFCCP comes in. All right, that's enough beating a dead horse there. So what are some of these issues as you look at looking at your certification, and kind of follows on to, go back, what, please? Follows on with what we were talking about as far as registration. So as, you know, many contractors, not every single entity under the parent is a federal contractor. So you need to assess how you're going to certify some, but not all, of those entities, if in fact you're in that situation. There are some clients that we have who have what's known as a separate facility waiver. One of the questions, that is something where OFCCP has given the company permission to not have to prepare AAPs for certain parts of the company that do not do federal contractor work. It's not clear to us right now exactly what those contractors will be certifying with respect to the part of the company that doesn't do affirmative action plans. We have some ideas. We've asked the OFCCP. We're going to follow up with them, with the solicitor's office, and try to get a clarification. But if you have these kinds of legal issues, you need to really assess what part is certifying, and that is all a legal assessment with your team and possibly outside counsel as well. So how are you, back to the point that Bert made earlier, how are you going to assess whether you have posters at every establishment, that you have, that you've done your assessment of outreach for your 503 and VEVRA plans, that you have on your poster, that you do your annual EEO letter from the CEO and that's properly posted as required, that you're collecting your affirmative action, all your applicant data, that you can determine all of that. How is that record keeping? And I think now is a good time. You've got a little bit of time left. Now is a good time to figure out what you're going to do to fix it. because moving forward, not only are you certifying that you're checking the box on all those 50 some odd requirements that you find in Part 60, but OFCCP is not going to give you any time to prepare this beyond the 30 days. When you get, as soon as they put up their new CSAL letter, they're going to say they potentially could send a scheduling letter to you and expect within 30 days you will submit not just your affirmative action plan, but all of your supporting data and your item 19. Bert?
Right. And just to repeat what we mentioned earlier, this is quite serious because your ability to certify is related to whether or not that algorithm will pluck you for an audit. So it all fits together. They've done a good job of meshing it. They've just left out, as far as I'm concerned, the difficulty that they're imposing on contractors and the speed with which they believe everybody can comply or be in a position to comply.
One other thing, and as you look at your EEO1s, as you get ready to file those for your 2021 data, who your parent is important for the portal. You can change your establishments, but you can't change the parent. So you want to make sure that the right part of the organization is saying it's a federal contractor and filing that for purposes of your EEO1 moving forward, because that's going to make, you can claim that you have separate entities, but OFCCP is not necessarily going to agree with you. Bert, I just wanted to mention in the next slide, for those of you who are looking for assistance in confirming your compliance, we at Fort Lee Scott have developed a very nifty little tool. We call it the legal check. Very clever, right? See the check? Anyway, if you want any more information, please let us know. It's at a very reasonable price, and it will help you figure out whether or not you're in compliance. I have had a number of clients do it, and they found it in fact, they found out things they didn't know, which was really interesting because of the nuance of the various provisions.
Yeah, it's a kind of neat tool, and it's very step-by-step. Very step-by-step. It's kind of user. I even could do it, and I'm not terribly computer adept. Moving right
Bert,
along. I just wanted to, I don't want to preempt the very detailed presentations that will be made regarding the new directives, but they do change the landscape, and that's why I just want to take another moment to remind you that these directives will be the subject of our succeeding webinars, but the sum and total is there will be in-depth reviews of your compensation programs. They want more data. They want it sooner. There are threats. It's going to be regulation by intimidation. They're going to be threatening to issue predetermination notices, notices of violation, orders to show cause at the drop of a hat. This changes the audit process. It permits more inquiries. It permits that they come faster. It gives the agency, I think, way more discretion than was imagined in the executive order. And we're back to the black box where we really don't know the standards by which we will be judged. That changes the meaning of compliant, as we've been reporting up till now, and meeting the expectations of these directives has already part of your obligations. The directives became effective when published. So, as I say, as you can read here, the compensation directive reinforces that contractors must do in-depth analyses of their compensation systems and reveal in some form the results of those surveys. The audit directive essentially takes away all of we call the guardrails that Director Lean established and gives the agency enormous discretion to what constitutes a compliance evaluation and what constitutes an indicator, what constitutes a violation. Nita?
Yeah, I just want to make clear, we specifically asked, David Fortney specifically asked DOL what they meant as far as what was required to certify for this compensation. And for purposes of certification, you, the contractor, are only required to have done some kind of analysis of your compensation system. We'll let Liz and John tell you in much more detail next week what OFCCP says you have to do or thinks you've done. But for purposes of the certification, you are certifying you have done something annually with respect to the pay, with respect to the compensation system, an analysis of some kind. That is all that's required. But it is an establishment by establishment assessment. And on the second one, basically, OFCCP is using certification as a rationale to eliminate all of the extensions that used to be allowed. And we'll let, I think, David Fortney is going to be talking, and Liz are going to give you all the ins and outs of 2022-02 on the 26th. So, Bert, I think we're going to talk about, with all these things that we're seeing OFCCP do, where's the money and the people? Bert, you're on mute.
Those of you who are real policy wonks probably recognize that a budget was finally passed in February. Supposed to be, fiscal year is September 1. And the OFCCP and many of the other enforcement agencies were given a pittance, OFCCP got a 2.5% increase in its budget. Look at what they're seeking in the next year's budget, a 40% increase, 41 million on a base of 105. From my point of view, that is fantasy land. We have a divided Congress. The next Congress may even be one with Republican majorities. The OFCCP has been in bad odor with Congress since before the GAO report. There was a budget statement issued 3 budgets ago that was just damning of the agency. So how and to what degree they are going to get sufficient funds to fund their ambitious programs remains to be seen. And I think this is more of a wish list than it is a realistic assessment of just what it is that the budget process will yield. And it will have a practical impact.
Valerie,
I can tell you,
think our slides are messed up. Go ahead, Bert.
We're on the budget.
Okay.
I know when I was deputy solicitor in the Labor Department, when it came to August, we started looking at our litigation calendar and figuring out where we could hold depositions, whether we could afford the travel, because we knew the money was going to run out on September 1. And, you can only spend appropriated dollars, period. There's no slush fund. And so I think the unrealistic budget request, I hope they're not planning on using that 41 million, because it's not coming, and the money that does come is not going to come for months after. And remember, if there is a continuing resolution, which is what we've had in every budget cycle for at least the last decade, it's going to freeze the budget at its current level until a new budget is passed. So that 2% increase that was granted in February will continue to September and beyond September into 2023 until the new Congress passes a new budget. Please, Nita.
One thing, though, that I think OFCCP does have in its back pocket is that it's got, they had permission So we have permission, they have permission to go ahead and hire, because in this budget justification, they're looking to increase the number of employees, which is at an all-time low at 420. And we have learned that there was, in fact, during the Trump administration, a freeze on hiring at OFCCP, which is why it was so low. And they want to increase it to 628. And that they've already been given permission, even under the budget they got, which is 108 million or so for under the budget that was just passed. In addition, Department of Labor got a lot of money in, 2021, when they passed some of the initial COVID numbers, budgets.
Yeah, under the American Recovery Plan,
right.
A huge slunk of dough was given to the Labor Department that will be doled out to the enforcement agencies, principally for personnel. The Labor Department has virtually no other budget than personnel. So there may be some increased hiring under the current fiscal year, but will they be able to sustain it? Remember, you can only spend appropriated dollars. So if you hire 600 people and your next budget only has enough dough for 422, guess what? They're going to be 422.
I do think they lost a lot of people in the Trump administration based on, just not agreeing. In fact, one of the ironies is one of the regional directors who left the agency, he was at the Southeast region, has now returned. And so that's an interesting turnabout. Well, we've talked about what they've asked for. We'll have to wait and see what they get. Obviously, budget is, especially in an election year, we're going to see lots of, finagling. But there were some other really interesting points, Bert, that I'd like to touch on quickly before we close this out, as to what their goals are. And I think one of the things that we've talked about over and over again in our podcasts and in other webinars is this new coordination among and between the enforcement agencies. I was watching an EEOC webinar where they were telling people how to file NLRB charges. I saw EEOC is doing a webinar with OFCCP on how to create effective affirmative action plans. I think we'll probably see one with wage and hour, EEOC and wage and hour, how to file a complaint with wage and hour. I mean, this is the kind of behaviors that we are seeing in this particular, and it's an efficient way, don't you think, for agencies that are doing similar kinds of work to share data?
Well, everybody wondered what all these agencies were doing during the COVID plague when they really couldn't leave their office, or even in their office. And what we've discovered over the past couple of months is they were hard at work figuring out ways to coordinate their efforts. There are a series of memorandum of understanding, MOUs, between the various agencies on information sharing, on investigation sharing, on joint programs. And I have to give credit to the Biden administration on this, if nothing else. They really have brought into reality the kinds of dreams of coordination that we've been hearing from administrations for the past 25 years. They're actually doing it. They have effective leadership at the NLRB, at the OFCCP. We may have a Democratic majority at the EEOC soon because there's a new commissioner who's just been nominated. So we may have we have an activist idea, and it may be put into place by some very effective activist administrators.
One other point I wanted to make on this slide, which is number 2. How about this one? Empowering workers by developing strong partnership with workers' rights organizations to better identify potential systemic issues in contractor workplaces. I think that, along with organizing, along with looking for, what they call pay theft and a lot of other things. And so this is a different kind of administration that we're dealing with.
Yeah. Well, some people call them effective worker hotlines. Other people call them kind of the Stasi has come to America, where you rat on your neighbor. But this is emblematic of this kind of suspicion that somehow or the other the businesses of America are cheating their workers, are discriminating against their employees, and yet, go back to our very first slide, 2% violations over the past decades, and the refusal to recognize that maybe they've succeeded, and that maybe the employers of America are much more concerned with getting someone who'll show up at 9 and stay till 5 than they are about their race, gender, or ethnicity. But that's for another podcast.
Well, as we're getting towards the end of this podcast, Bert, I thought we ought to go through what our next steps for those who are participating on this particular webinar.
Yeah, well, it's the broken record. Get yourself in position to register soon, because you may be confronted with glitches. It is no surprise that this is a new program. It's going to have, there are tens of thousands of contractors. Many contractors have many AAPs, so the data flow is going to be enormous. And so get yourself into a position to register soon so that you don't get hung up in the glitches.
And I think combined with that is you want to make sure that you've undergone a legal review of your organization. What's in your 2018 EEO1? Is that still accurate? What about the single entity obligations? Do you have any other, or which of your facilities really are federal contractors? All of those kinds of issues. And also, on top of everything else, you need to really evaluate and make sure that you can certify in a good faith way that you're in compliance.
There'll be a new CSAL list coming. We're told it's coming soon. It'll be based on a new algorithm, but don't commit to it, because a newer algorithm is also being planned. And that second algorithm is the more important, since it's going to try to integrate the data derived from the certification process. So there'll be a new CSAL. It'll be somewhat different from what we've seen in the past, and there'll be a still newer one post-certification.
We are already seeing this with the audits that we have going on, but all our new audits are going to be wide and deep. They're under, as we understand, so they've not done much. I mean, I think this is really the first thing we've seen this agency do since Director Yang was put in place, literally on Inauguration Day. She started the same day as President Biden did. And they're under enormous pressure to show that they're making progress. And so expect that if you get audited and there are problems, they're going to really, look at everything. And we're not going to steal the thunder for our colleagues who will be coming up and giving you much more information on all of the new directives, but just be prepared that they're going to be looking under rocks, and they're also going to be looking across your organization to the extent that they can.
Yeah.
Well, Bert, shall we just have our final thoughts, and then we can roll out?
Yeah, I can see we're running out of time. I suppose, I guess the combining, subsuming thought that I have is we have an agency that is energized, aggressive, and suspicious. There is this kind of unstated belief that if they only looked harder and tried harder, they would find the discrimination that they have not found since the program started back in the 60s. So I urge everyone to get their ducks in a row as best they can. Get their, as I say, the whole HR team, the whole compensation team, and your general counsel. Have your strategies in place, because across the board, there's going to be a newly aggressive enforcement scheme.
And just to reinforce what Bert just said, we heard similar things, or I should say David Fortney heard similar things from the DOL at this most recent ABA meeting. So that's what you can expect. Well, Bert, I think we've covered all of the issues and any questions that came up. So we look forward for you all. Please join us again on our on the 19th. We'll talk about the compensation directive, and on the 26th we'll talk about the audit directive. And please listen to our podcast. Bert and I are on almost every one of our podcasts, and we talk about these same subjects, and we have a lot of fun actually, and so you can subscribe. And so with that, I turn this back over to Valerie, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Thanks everyone. Hope this was useful.
We would like to thank you for joining us. The next presentation in our webinar series will discuss the impact of OFCCP new compensation directive. This webinar will be presented on Tuesday, April 19th at 12 noon. Be on the lookout for additional updates, which will be sent via email. Later today, you will receive a survey requesting feedback for today's presentation. You're able to submit suggestions for future topics in the survey. Thank you in advance for completing this survey, and of course, if you have any questions, you may submit them via email to info@fortonscott.com.